There are a lot of design patterns out there. In this series, I focus on the ones that are easiest to understand and implement. The factory design pattern is one of them. If you've been working with Laravel for a while, you probably use the user factory. This is used to create some test data within your tables. You probably guessed by now. User factory uses the factory design pattern. In the first part of the video, I'm going to take you and create a task with the factory design pattern. Once we know what it is, then we can look at Laravel's implementation of the factory design pattern. And it's a bit different than what everybody else is doing. It's going to be fun and exciting, but before we get into it, let me give you an overview of what we're going to build. We are going to pretend that we work for a company that has a website which shows you the best movies you could watch this week. Let's say there are times TMDB has the best movies that we could show our viewers. Then there'll be times OMDB is leading the way. Lastly, there's ANSDB. So we will be switching between these APIs based on the service we see it's best. And we're going to use the factory design pattern to do this. This is going to be fun. So let's get into it.
What is the 5 fingers say to the face? What? Slap!
So let's first understand what the factory pattern is. So at the bottom I have two boxes. One represents the OMDB website. We've created a class which is going to go and hit the OMDB website and get the top movies from their website using their APIs. Then on the right hand side I have a TMDB website. Now we're going to hit this website using the class that we're going to create. We're going to get the top movies from their website. Given the situation, at the top you'll notice I have 3 controllers. So right now our site is very small, and what we have is whenever a site visitor shows up, we're going to use this controller to get the top movies for them. Then we have an admin controller. We're going to show them the top movies along with some other data. Lastly, we have an API controller. Given the situation, your manager walks in and tells you, listen, today we're going to be using the OMDB website. We're going to use this class and hit their APIs to get the top movies. We go to the site visitor controller, we create an object of the OMDB class, and then we get the top movies using the methods that we've made. We do the same thing with the admin controller and the API controller. Things are going simple. Then a week goes by, the same manager walks in and says, listen, the OMDB website, it's working well, but we need to switch over to the TMDB website. They have better movies and they're charging less money. So you make the necessary changes, but you make a small mistake. In the API controller, you forget to change the code. You're still creating an object of the OMDB class and you're still accessing their site. Now you're saying this would never happen to me, but let's say you're having a bad day. Or let's say there's not 3 classes, they're not 3 controllers, but there's more of them. You make that small mistake. The problem with this is the company is getting double billed. The TMDB website is going to send them a bill for all the API hits that it's gotten. And then the OMDB website is also going to send them a bill. Once they see the double billing, they also notice that their users are getting old movies, which could be driving them away from your website. This is going to cause a lot of arguments. You changed the code in this one, you also changed it in this one, but because you forgot to change it in the API controller, now the company is going to get a double bill. So let's take a look at another approach. Instead of having the site visitor, admin, or API controller create an object of the OMDB or TMDB directly, we're going to put a class in the middle. This class job is to create an object of the service we're supposed to use. And whenever these controllers need access to the movies, they're going to ask the factory class for that object. They're going to ask the factory class, hey, do you have an object that you can pass on to us? This way, you only have to change your code in one place. So let's say a week goes by, your manager walks in and says, this week we're going to focus on the TMDB website. Because you're only changing the code in one place, you don't have to worry about forgetting anything. Before you had, let's say 3 controllers, 10, 15. You don't have to worry about that now. It could be 100 controllers. You're only making the change in one place, and that's the factory class. So there are no changes in the controllers you have. You're only making the change in one place. That's the factory class. So let's create the movie feature. I'm going to go to my file explorer. In app HTTP, I'm going to right click, create a folder called services. Now inside of the services folder, create a folder called movie service. Inside of the movie service folder, I'm going to create a file called OMDB service. Now this is the website we're going to hit and we're going to use their APIs to get the top movies. I'm going to write down .php. I want you to notice something. This folder structure doesn't look right in here. So I'm just going to create a dummy file. On services, I want you to right click, create a new file. Let's just call it user service.php. Now this looks a little bit better. We can visually see it much more better this way. In movie services, we've created an OMDB service file. This is the API we're going to hit. PHP, let's create some basic information in here. Namespace. Now, if you're using VS Code, you can see your namespace right above here. So I'm just going to use that. Now I'm going to create the class OMDB service. I'm going to create a property, and inside of our construct, we'll say API key. Now, I could put the API key in here, but if you've been programming for a while, you know this is a very bad approach. You shouldn't have it here. So if not here, then where? That would be the env file. The .env file is where you want to put your API keys. So let's go there. I'm going to go to my file explorer, scroll down to .env. At the very bottom, I'm going to write down movie OMDB API key, and then let's just type in some random values for now. Okay? Now I can copy this out, go back to my class. Over here, I can remove this and paste that in there. If it doesn't find this, then it will give me a blank value, which is good enough. I can throw an error and say, look, you need to give me the API key. This is good, but we could do better. By better, what I mean is if tomorrow on the server somebody runs the PHP artisan cache command, what that does is it stops Laravel from reading the env file. At that point, Laravel only reads from the config. So here's what I mean by that. I'm in my env file. Here's a DB database value. I'm going to copy this out. Now I'm in my console and I'm going to write down PHP artisan tinker. I'm going to access my env value and it prints just fine. I'm going to exit out. Now I'm going to write down PHP artisan. And if you scroll up, you'll see there's a command called config cache. And surprisingly, the cache command actually makes things faster. PHP artisan. So after I run this command, I'm going to go back into PHP artisan tinker and run the same command of the env. Notice I get back a blank. As soon as the cache command is run, Laravel takes all the values of the env and puts them in the config, and it only reads from the config. So if you try to use the env in your code and someone runs the cache command, you're just going to get back a null value, and you won't understand what happened because when you go back to your env file, you're actually going to see the value you always had, which is this one. We should not use the env file. We should put this value inside of the config. And let's go to our file explorer. There's a config and there's a services file. If you scroll up, it says third-party services. This is where you could put your third-party services information. For me, this is good enough. I'm going to scroll down, write down movie. I'm going to write down OMDB API key. And this is where I'm going to paste the env. So whenever somebody runs the cache command, Laravel is going to go to the env, copy that file into this location, and that point on, I'm safe. I don't have to worry about this information. I'm going to go back to my class, and now I'm going to use the config helper. I know my config is in the services file, and from there I can just copy this key, and inside of this key is this key, which will hold the API key value. So now that we've done that, now let's create another method called get top movies. And obviously there's going to be a limit. Like we don't want 100 of those things. We probably just want 5, 10 top movies. Now at this point I need to discuss something with you. In the beginning I went to the OMDB website, created a key, and then I went to another movie website, created their key. And that's when I realized something. Going to these places, registering, creating a key, it takes a long time. And then for you to come back and then start this all over again, this will be a time-consuming process. Our goal is not to learn about their APIs. So at this point, we're going to pretend that we've hit their API keys, and then we're going to use some dummy values, and let's just move on from there. So I pasted in some dummy values. By the way, this code is going to be on GitHub. A link to it is going to be in the description. Now let's go over this array. What I've done is I've given the name of the movie, then I've given a genre. On the left-hand side, at the very beginning, I've given the source. Right now, I'm hitting the OMDB website, so I put down OMDB. I'm going to go to the bottom and return these values. I'm going to turn this into a collection, movie list. The reason for that is I want to return a certain number of results. So I'm just going to copy this variable inside and then turn this back into an array. I'm going to hit save. And now let's create the TMDB service, which is going to be very much similar to this. In fact, I could just copy all of this, go to my file explorer, inside the movie service, create another file and call it tmdbservice.php. I'm going to paste all that information in here and then change this into a T. Where I'm getting my keys needs to change, so I'm going to say tmdb service. I'll have to go back to my env file, copy this out again, and turn that into a T. Let's change the values to something else for the sake of it. I'll have to go back to my config. Inside the config file, I'll have to do the same thing again. I'll turn that into a T, and then turn this into a T. I'm going to go back to my TMD service. Source is equal to OMDB. I need to change this. So as soon as you select this, if you're on Windows, hit Control and then D. It selects similar values like it. And if you're on a Mac, you could do Option D. So I'm going to turn the first letter into a T and hit Save. Now I have two services. Sometimes I'm hitting the OMDB website. Sometimes I'm hitting the TMDB website. Let's actually use these services. I'm going to go to my console. I write down PHP artisan make controller, and let's call it movie controller. I'm going to come back here and go to my routes. In fact, instead of using the file explorer, why don't I just hold down the control and hit P? At this point I can say web, and the web routes is where I want to go. At this point, this is good. Let me just remove this part of it because I plan on going to the movie controller. So movie, there it is. I'm just going to hit tab, and you'll notice at the very top, it imports the movie controller. I'm going to turn this into a class, some basic stuff. Now I'm going to control click into the file. If you're not seeing this and you would like to, I want you to go to VS Code's extensions and install PHP IntelliSense by Ben Mewburn. And there's also PHP namespace resolver. Mehdi Hassan. Install these two extensions. They're really helpful when you're working with PHP. Now I'm going to come back and control click into movie controller. Okay, so let's create the first method. Call this index. And let's create a variable which is going to contain the OMDB service. Since I'm using VS Code, I just hit tab and it brought up the file right up here. Next, I'm going to say movie, and let's say I want two of them. Let's save this information into a variable, and let's just throw this on the screen. So I'll say return, and then we'll say movies. Now when I refresh my browser, I can see two movies are there. So this seems to be working. Now let's create a controller for the admin and for the API controllers, and they're all going to be serving the same thing. And this one we'll call the admin controller. We'll do the same thing for the API controller. Instead of typing everything out again, I'm just going to go copy and paste. And then I'll just right click and import the class. I'm going to hit Control P, type in admin controller, paste the information in there. Right click and import. You'll notice that we have this part down. We have a site visitor controller, an admin controller, and an API controller. The next step was to make sure an OMDB movie service class object was within these controllers. But we've done that as well. The next step at this point is to go and change the code to point to the TMDB service. So now let's go to each one and change that code. And now I'm just going to change this to TMDB. Now I'm just going to right click and import that class. And let me just copy this one more time into the admin controller. It's going to ask me to import the class. I'm going to do that real quick. Once I reload my browser, you'll notice that I'm getting my movies now from TMDB. But you'll notice that we did not change the code in the API controller. In fact, it's still getting from the OMDB service. And this is something that's likely to happen once the website starts growing. You could have 20 controllers, 30 controllers. It could be in various places. And let's say months from now, when they ask you to change the code, you'll forget to change it in one place, just like we discussed at the beginning. So again, you'll notice that we had to change the code in each one of the controllers. The second approach involves creating a class in the middle. This would be our factory class. So let's go ahead and start with it. I'm going to go to my Explorer, and right where I see movie services, I'm going to right click, movie, factory.php. I'm going to put in the basic information, and now let's create a method called create. At this point, I'm going to make this static, And the reason for that is I don't need an object of the movie class. I just need it to return me an object. You'll notice that we only need the factory class to pass us an object to the service we want. This is why making the static is a better approach. Next, I'll say movie service. The one we want at this point is OMDB. But since I'm trying to create an object of this class, I'm going to need a namespace of it. So let's go and type the namespace, much similar to what I see up here. I'm going to copy this. Next, we need to convert this single backslash into a double backslash. And the reason for that is if you only have one backslash, it turns into an escape sequence. Since we don't want that, I'm going to select this. I'm going to hit Control D. And what this allows me to do is select similar characters. So I'm going to hit 2 backslashes. And now I have a namespace. In fact, let me put that here as well. Now I'm going to check if the class actually exists. So here we'll say namespace and join it with movie service. But you'll notice over here I only wrote down OMDB. If you take a look at the services, it starts with a capital letter and it always ends with the word service. If you look at TMDB service, it's the same naming convention. It ends with the word service and it always starts with a capital letter. So maybe we should do that here as well. In fact, let me turn this into a capital O. So now it should be able to detect if this class actually exists. But in the case we have a typo and this class doesn't exist, we should return an error. So I'll say return exception. So if you look over the code, what we've done is we named the movie service class that we want. Then we gave the namespace. Now at this point, we're checking if there was a typo, we should be able to catch it. Now let's return an object. So I'm going to say return new namespace movie service. Here's something I need you to realize. If you just do it this way, new is going to try to create an object of namespace alone. And whatever it creates, it will then try to append it to movie service. We don't want that. So we're going to put this inside of a parentheses. And now it means, listen, create an object of this whole thing. So we'll take the namespace and the class that we have chosen and then give us an object of that. And now I'm going to move to the movie controller. Now in the movie controller, I no longer need to create an object. I'll comment this out. I'll say movie service factory. The class has been imported at the top. And since this is a static method, I can just do this and hit save. The static create method in the movie factory class is going to return me an object of the service that we have chosen. So now I can copy this. I'm going to move to my admin controller and then let's comment this out. Paste it in there. I'm going to import the class. Let's do the same thing for the API controller. I'm going to comment this out. Let's review what we just did. We went to each one of these controllers and said, listen, you will only get an object from the factory class. Inside the factory class, we have centralized code, meaning that we only create an object inside of this class, and whichever object we create is then passed off to all the controllers. It could be 3, it could be 300. It doesn't matter to us anymore. We've centralized the code. So if tomorrow we need to switch from TMDB to OMDB, we only have one place to change. So in the past, each time you wanted to change where we were getting the movie list from, we had to create another object. That meant we had to go to each single controller and change the code there. Now with the factory class, all the controllers are calling the factory class and asking it for an object. The only place the object is being created is inside the factory class. So if tomorrow we need to change anything or need to add a class, we only need to change the factory class. And this would return the object that the controllers need to use. Now I want you to imagine your manager walks in and tells you, there's this new site called AnsDB. Their movies are so much better and so is their pricing. From now on, we're going to use AnsDB. Step 1 would be to create AnsDB class. Step 2 would be to go and change the factory class to make sure that it points to AnsDB. At no point are we going to go to any controllers we have and change the code there, because they're going to continue to ask the factory class which object to use. So the only place we need to make a change is the factory class. I want you to compare this to the past. In the past, we used to create all the objects inside the controllers. So if you had 5, 10, 15 controllers, you would have to go to each one of them and make that change. And if you forgot to make that change, it would lead you to double billing or many other problems with management. Inside of VS Code, I'm going to the Explorer, right click, and say service.php. I'm going to copy and paste from OMDB service. Let's paste it here, and I'll change the name of the class to AnDB. For now, I'm just going to skip this step. If you want to add it, you know what to do. Go to the env file, then to the config file, and then copy it from there. Next, I'm going to go to the getTopMovies method and change the source here to n. So this way, when we view it on the screen, we know where the data is coming from. I'm going to select this text, hit Control D. If you're on a Mac, you know what to do. It's Option D. And let's just type in n. And then let's go to the movie factory class. Over here, I just need to change this value from TMDB to ANDB. And that's it. That's all I had to do to integrate a new service or a new website into the code. I didn't have to go to each one of the controllers and change anything. Now when I reload my page, I'll see ANSDB. This is how simple it was to connect to a new class, or let's say a third-party service. So your manager walks back in and he has another idea. It's good to see the top movies, but there should be one that's doing really well, and that's the one he wants to show his visitors. So we're going to create another method. Let's call it getTopMovie without the S. Over here, we're just going to return an array of the best movie that we have. Now, I want you to understand something. We have three services. One is ANSDB, the other one's OMDB, and the third one's TMDB. I want you to pretend that you had another team member and you told him to just change this one class. Let's say he's a junior software engineer. So in the first class, you've created this one. I'm going to copy it, go to OMDB service, and in this one, you paste it, and the only thing you need to change is this name. So we'll change it to OMDB. Now in TMDB service class, you ask somebody else to work on it. And instead of saying getTopMovie, he decides to call it getBestMovie. Because to him, this makes much more sense. It's easier to read. And then he returns an array. Let's copy this one right here. So inside of our API controller, we are going to call the new method. So we'll say top movie is movie service, whichever object that is. And we'll say get top movie. Let's add that to the response. We'll say top movie is equal to top movie. Let's do the same thing in movie controller. I'll go here, paste the information. Over here, I'll say top movie. In the admin controller, I'll do the same thing. You'll notice that it's working so far because we're hitting ANSDB. But if you look in our code, there is a mistake present. This one's best movie, and this is not going to surface until we change the movie factory class. So let's do that. Inside a movie factory class, we'll change this back to TMDB. And you'll notice I get an error this time, and it's telling me that I have an undefined method called getTopMovie. So the question is there a way to prevent this type of mistake? Because tomorrow you could have more people on your team and they could be making mistakes like this. So I'm back in VS Code, and the solution to this problem is called interface. We are going to create an interface and have these classes implement that interface. In case you don't know what an interface is, don't worry, I'll explain it in a few seconds. I'm going to go back to my Explorer, and inside of the movie service, I'm going to right click, say new file. I'll call this movie interface.php. I'm going to put in some basic stuff like the namespace, and then I'll say interface. So let's talk about what an interface is. Inside of an interface, you can define exactly which methods each class needs to create and exactly what name to give them. I read that Taylor Otwell at one point called interfaces contracts. And just like contracts in real life, you can hand them to as many people as you want to. So whoever signs that has to follow the rules inside of that contract. Inside of this interface or contract, we can define the methods each class needs to create, what the name those methods should be, the arguments those methods should receive. And whoever follows this contract, whichever class follows this contract or interface, needs to follow those rules. They need to abide by those rules. So let's try this out. I'm going to go to my TMDB class. I'll just copy this part right here. I'm going to come back to my interface and paste that in. Next, I'll go to my TMDB class, and you know what? Let's just copy this. We'll call it getBestMovie. We'll paste that in here. Now I'm going to copy the name of the interface, go to the TMDB class, and after the word class, I'm going to say implements this contract, the movie interface. Inside of OMDB service, I'll say implements movie interface. Now you notice as soon as I hit save, it gives me the red squiggly line, meaning there's something wrong. And when I hover over that, it tells me that this class does not implement method getBestMovie. Right away, as soon as I'm making this class, it lets you know there's a problem. So you can fix it right then and there. So I'm going to go ahead, scroll down, and turn this into getBestMovie. When I scroll back up, the error is gone. Let's go to ANSDB service and do the same thing. Implements movie interface. As soon as I hit save, I get the same exact error, letting me know that I need to change the name. Again, this is a contract. Everyone who follows this contract needs to abide by the rules in the contract. And the contract is telling us to create this method and make the necessary change. Now I hit save. And over here, let's change this to getBestMovie. In fact, I'll have to make this change to the movie controller as well. Now when I refresh my browser, you'll notice that I'm getting the top movies along with the best movie being listed separately. I'm back in VS Code and I'm going to change this from TMDB to ANDB. And now I'm seeing ANDB again. I'm seeing the top movies and I'm now seeing the best movies listed separately. So now I want to focus on the folder structure. You'll notice that we have one folder and we threw all the files inside of it. This doesn't look very organized. Right click on the folder and now we'll create another folder called Providers. And inside of this Providers folder, we're going to drag in ANSDB service. And you guessed it, we're also going to drag in OMDB service along with TMDB service. In fact, any of the databases or any of the websites we're connecting to, we'll put that inside of Providers. You can name this folder anything you want to. For now, we'll call this Providers. Now, outside this folder, we have the Movie Factory and one interface. This looks much more organized. Since we've changed the location of the providers, I'm going to click on them and I need to update the namespace. I'll put in Providers and right below it, you'll see Movie Interface. Movie Interface is not within the Providers folder. In fact, it's outside of it. So I need to right click on this and say Import Class. And now it seems to be working out. I'll do the same thing for the other classes. OMDB service, I need to update the namespace. Right click on the interface and say Import Class. Last but not least, we have TMDB service. I update the namespace and then say Import Class. Next, I need to go to the Movie Factory class and update the namespace here as well. I'm going to say Providers, and this is updated as well. We don't need to update the controllers because you'll notice we're trying to create an object of the Movie Factory class, and that hasn't changed. Only the Providers has changed. So now our folder structure looks a bit nicer. In fact, tomorrow you could add 10 more websites in here and it wouldn't bother the person reading your code. They could easily say, okay, here's a factory, here's the interface, and here are all the providers that he has. So in my env file, there's a DB connection. I can specify which type of database I want to connect to just by changing the value here. Let's try to do the same thing for our movie class. I'm going to scroll down and over here, let's create movie. I'm going to copy this and paste it there. Now earlier in the video, I told you if somebody runs the cache command, what happens is the env file is no longer available to us. So let's copy this into the service as well. I'm going to hit Control P, write down config, oops, caps lock there. And then over here, I'm going to put the same thing. Connection, env, we'll paste that value. And in case it's not found, let's send back a blank. I'm going to go back to the Movie Factory class, comment this out. Let's say movie service, and inside the config, there's the services file. And inside the services file, let me just copy and paste. And then I'll copy and paste this as well. At this point, whatever value we put in the env file, that is the website or service we're going to connect to. I've refreshed my browser, and at this point, you can see everything's going right. So I want you to imagine your manager walks back in and he tells you this is great and all, but last night at 11 o'clock, he realized that the movie service or the movie site we were getting our movies from wasn't doing such a great job. And instead, he wanted to switch to another movie site, which was providing a much more better list. After seeing that scenario, he wants this to be dynamic, meaning that he wants to go to a drop down save something into the database, and this should read from the database instead. I'm at my console. I'm going to create a migration, create general settings table. I'm going to say create general, and there's the migration I just created. I'm going to come here and let's just, for now, we'll call this movie service. Now I'm just going to run the migration. I realized I forgot to create the model, so I'm going to say PHP general setting. I'm back in VS Code. I'm going to hit Control P and write down general setting, and there's my model. I'm going to put in the guard. So I'm at my console again. I'm going to write down PHP artisan tinker, and then let's just give the namespace here along with the class, and we'll say, so this is what I'm going to create into the database. I'm going to copy this. I'm back in my movie factory class. I'm going to comment this out. General setting. When I hit tab, it's imported at the very top. I'm mentioning this in case you're not using VS Code. After this, so now whenever the value is changed in the database, at that very second, we're going to be switching our movie service. Now we no longer have to change the env file. We can pick the value up from the database. Now for the manager, you could create an interface where there's a drop-down value. As soon as you select something, it's saved into the database table. Once that value is saved in the database, we can easily read from it and assign it here. This is something that would suit the manager and the scenario he has just described. So congratulations. At this point, you know what the factory design pattern is. You've actually created 3 different variations of it. Meaning first, you set the hard-coded value right within the factory class. The second one is where you're reading from the env file. And the third one is you're reading from the database. Now that you understand what the factory design pattern is, let's take a look at how Laravel is using it. Now that you understand what the factory design pattern is, let's see how Laravel is using it. If you've been using Laravel, you more than likely have used the factory. Over here, you're saying user, factory, create. But if you look at the factory part, you're calling a static method named factory. And when you do that, you're actually going to the factory part of the design pattern. At this point, this class will look at who's calling it. And if user is calling it, it will go to database factories and then look for user factory. But let's say if leave is calling it, leave factory. The factory class is going to look at who's calling it. Well, leave is calling it. Then it will go and move towards leave factory class, which is located in database factories. This is how Laravel is using it. It's using the factory class to create an object based on the caller. I'm in VS Code right now, and let's take a look at some of the code. Maybe this will clear things up. Right now, I'm in user, and then here's a trait called hasFactory. If I control click into it, and I scroll down, well, there's a static method named factory. I'm going to write this down here as well. User, factory. Now I've written the command down here so we can reference it. So we're looking for a static method named factory. Well, here it is. And in this one, what is the first thing we're doing? We're going to another static method named new factory. If you scroll down, it's defined in the same file. And in this case, we're looking for a property named factory. Now, if the property exists, it will go and create an object of that one. But the question is, why is it looking for a property named factory? I have my Explorer open. So on the root of the folder, there is database, factories, and here are all of our factory classes. If for some reason you didn't want to use the default path, you could create a new folder, and then in a property named factory, you could define the location for the files where you put your factory classes. So this is really for a custom location. I'm going to scroll back up. That's what the first part of the statement is. Now this second part of the code is going to go to the default location where all the factory classes are located. But still, let's see what it says. Right now I see the factory class, and then I see a static method on it. Before I control click into this, I'm going to go to my Explorer, and at the root there's database, factories, and there's the user factory. When I open this file, you see it extends the factory class. Now in this part of the code, we're also trying to hit the factory class. When I control click into factory for model, I'm actually referencing the same class that the user factory is using. In the factory for model, I'm passing in the model name. So if I go back where I'm calling this method, I'm actually passing in the name of the model that is calling this method. In this particular case, it's user. Now this information is further passed to resolve factory name. Now in this particular method, what they're doing is, if you go through all this code, it's actually looking for the namespace. Once it knows what the namespace is, then it asks which model is calling it. In our case, it's the user model. Lastly, it appends the word factory on it. Now let's look at it. Here's the namespace, database factories. So the namespace is holding database factories. Then the model name is user. So over here we have user. It's appended with the word factory, same as is done here. This whole thing is a full path to the user factory class. If you go back to the factory for model, this is where we started digging into the code. You'll notice once it finds the full path to the class user factory, it creates a new method of it. Now this isn't saying new and then the factory, it's actually calling another method on it called new. If I control click into it, you'll notice this method is creating a new object of that class. So I have my Explorer open, and if the user model calls a static method factory, it's going to get an object of the user factory. If the leave model calls the factory static method, then it's going to get an object of the leave factory located in database factories. So this is how Laravel is using the factory design pattern to implement the user factory. In the description, please let me know if this was a clear enough definition. If it's not, I can create another video which is going to be using Laravel's method of the factory pattern. And once we create something with it, maybe it will help clear up the confusion. But before we go down that road, I want you to understand the amount of effort I place into these videos. The least you could do is click one button. You could click the subscribe button or the like button. And once I have 50, meaning a combination of likes and subscribe. Once that count goes up to 50, I'll be more than happy to create a video which is going to be using Laravel's version of the factory pattern. Until then, stay safe and have fun.